Another literary lunch break with the Texas Book Festival. I'm Katie. I'm the communications and marketing coordinator at the book festival. Today I'm going to be talking to Asher Price, who's joining us soon. He wrote a great book about Earl Campbell. There he is. Let's see if we can. Oh, I'm about to spill water everywhere here, guys, but Asher added if we can. All right, I sent the invite, but yeah, I'm talking to Asher Price today, who is one of my former colleagues at the Austin American Statesman. Oh, it looks like he's connecting right now. Hi.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm okay. Let me just check. I'm putting myself upside down. Can you hear me?
Now you're upside down for me.
Okay.
So I'm back over.
All right.
There we go.
And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, this is great. It's good to see you.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. So for those watching, Asher is a journalist at the Austin American Statesman, where I used to work. So we go way back, a couple years back.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I wore my burnt orange today since we're talking about Earl Campbell.
Great.
I had to get in the
Great.
spirit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we're going to be talking about your book, Earl Campbell, Yards After Contact. So I guess let's start, in Austin, I feel like probably, and in Texas, I feel like a lot of us probably know who Earl Campbell is, but can you give us kind of a brief overview of the book and who he was and is, for those who may not know about your book or that much about Earl?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me, and I think it's great that the book festival is hosting these things. It's a tribute to you, Katie, but it's also, the book festival making lemonade out of lemons, given the state that we're all in. So I appreciate it. My hat's off to you.
Thanks for joining us. These have been fun.
Earl, as you said, Earl is legendary in Texas, but the short of it is he grew up in really straitened circumstances in East Texas, in Tyler, during a time of desegregation. And he was one of 11 kids growing up in basically a shack of a home. He leads his high school football team to the state championship. He's recruited by the Longhorns. Darrell Royal is the football coach at UT. His name, now graces the stadium at UT. And Royal had long presided over an all-white team, and in the early 70s, he starts integrating the team. And Earl Campbell isn't the first African-American player on the team, but he's in that kind of first wave. And so a lot of the book is also about the long road to integration, both of the football team and at the University of Texas. He wins the Heisman Award at Texas. He's, his kind of running style is blunt. He's a running back, and he runs over people. It's beautiful to watch. Actually, you can see kind of old footage on YouTube for those of you who may not have been there in the flesh. And then he goes to play professionally for the Houston Oilers in the late 1970s. He's the #1 overall pick. He wins the Rookie of the Year award, and he twice leads the Oilers kind of to the brink of greatness. He is playing at the time that the Pittsburgh Steelers are ascendant, and so the story that I tell kind of charts that professional rise, but it's against what's going on in Texas at the time. So that's kind of the thumbnail version of it.
Yeah. So what made you tell us a little bit about how this book came about? You're not a native Texan, but you're kind of an adopted Longhorn by this point, right? So,
yeah.
So tell us where you got this idea and why you thought it was an important story to be told outside of Earl just being a great football player.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. No, it's totally true. I'm an imposter. I did not grow up in Texas. I wasn't born here. And I became a Longhorn fan when I moved here about 15 years ago. and something kind of struck me. I grew up in New York City, and I collected football cards as a kid, and and I knew about Earl as a little kid. Um, and he was this kind of Paul Bunyan figure, kind of larger than life, who was known for running over people, um, and uh, and also being very friendly off the field. That was kind of his reputation: ruthless on the field, friendly off it. But there are all these stories. His thighs were the diameter of a man's waist, um, that kind of thing. So I started going to UT football games when I moved to Austin, and and he came out to do the coin flip before a game, and he was hobbled. He could barely make it to midfield.
Yeah, they
There was a
usually have to drive him out there now, like on a golf
Yeah,
cart. Yeah.
exactly. That's right. There's a dignity about him, but he was definitely kind of um, he was limited.
Hmm.
And so part of me just at the time wondered, well, what had happened to Earl Campbell? What happened to this figure of my youth, this legendary character? But the other thing that started happening is I lived in Texas, over a decade. At this point, I started thinking, I maybe a little presumptuously and a little ambitiously, that I wanted to tell a real Texas story. I wanted to tell a story about how Texas had changed. Um, and when I thought about this moment with Earl, I was trying to figure out someone to tell that story around. Because as you kind of touched on, I didn't want to just tell a football story. I didn't want to tell a story about, oh, Earl Campbell gets the football, he runs through the line, he scores the touchdown. That wasn't going to be a very interesting story for me to write
Right.
as an author, and I don't think it would be very interesting to read either.
Especially for those of us who know a lot of that already.
Yeah, exactly. So I started thinking about what I these sort of two things were playing out in my head, and I started learning more about Earl and about the path that he took as I traced out briefly from East Texas, deeply segregated East Texas, through University of Texas at a time when the university was having growing pains, in the late 60s and early 70s, and then to the great metropolis of Houston. And that his whole story was a Texas story. And so started thinking, well, I could tell a certain story about Texas using him as a vehicle and using his trajectory. And so I kind of go back and forth between what's happening with Earl Campbell in his career and what's happening more broadly.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the Tyler that he grew up in and the Austin that he kind of continued to grow up in. Those of us who have been in Texas for a while, I grew up here, especially know that, Tyler then didn't have Texas doesn't have a great track record with race relations in general, and especially East Texas. Like, there was a KKK newspaper in Tyler, and then UT, as you mentioned, of course, doesn't have the best track record with racial issues and segregation and desegregation as well. So, can you talk a little bit more about the Tyler that Earl grew up in, and then kind of what he experienced when he got to UT? Like you said, not being the first Black player, but among the first, and also, Darrell K. Royal not having the best reputation with race on his teams as well until Earl got there. So can you talk a little bit more about like the environment he grew up in and the environment he moved to when he got to Austin?
Yeah, sure, of course. And well, let me sort of remind people. Tyler is, as you said, Katie, in East Texas. It's sort of northeast Texas. It's east of Dallas by about 100 miles, I think. And to give you, it's really part of the Deep South. And to give you a sense of this, back in about 1860, the state of Texas, oddly enough, had a vote about whether to secede from the Union. There was a referendum. And in Texas as a whole, that passed by a 3-1 margin. But in Smith County, where Tyler is, that passed by a 20-1 margin.
Wow.
They really wanted to secede. And I mention that only as a touchstone to say that's where Smith County was coming from. Um, and this was Earl Campbell was born in 1955, a year after Brown versus Board of Education. But as growing up, he wouldn't have been able to go through the white entrance as a very little kid at the state park. There was a separate black entrance. He went to all black schools through junior high. The county festival had one night a week reserved for African Americans through the 1970s.
Wow.
That night was called N-word nights. That was the night when African Americans were permitted to come to the festival. Even when Earl was a teenager, you would have had to go to the back of a lot of restaurants. This is in the 60s now, early 70s, to pick up food. So there's a saying that when you get to Tyler, it's in its own time zone. You have to set your clock 50 years back. So that's the kind of environment that Earl grew up in. I mean, he saw himself as a racial, conciliator. He brought people together through football. He would look up into the stands, and everybody was into the John Tyler High School football team. And there was an African American teacher who was at the school that year who said, "I never got hugged by as many white women as I did that year." That's what she said. There was this sort of, that she looked at it more cynically, that there was this coming together. But I think Earl, sees it more kind of openly, ecumenically. He's very kind of open-minded that way. So that's the Tyler that Earl's coming from. And a third of the book basically is about that Tyler, and about even the story of his naming. He's named by the white doctor that delivers him. I mean, he's named, the white doctor who delivers him is named Earl Christian Kinsey, and Earl Campbell's name is Earl Christian Campbell. That doctor went on to deliver Anne Campbell's next two kids, and she wanted to name them something like John and Jacob, and he named them Tim and Steve. And when she was well enough recovered from the delivery, she went down to the county courthouse to change the names, and she was told it would cost $100, and she didn't have that money. So they became forever known as Tim and Steve. But that's just a strange story involving, race relations in Tyler. So that's the Tyler part. Then he is recruited by Darrell Royal to UT, and that's a involved story. But in many ways, Austin, of course, at the time is like diametrically opposite Tyler. I mean, this is, Earl Campbell gets to Austin in 1974, and when you talk to Austinites now, older Austinites, about what the glory days were of Austin, that was the time. That's when you could see a young Stevie Ray Vaughan, or Townes Van Zandt play music. Frank Zappa was in town the year that Earl Campbell comes to campus. I mean, there's no shortage of, Bruce Springsteen came through Austin to play, at Armadillo World Headquarters. So there's that kind of halcyon period in Austin. This kind of counterculture period. There's a gay pride parade in Austin in 1974. So none of that was happening in Tyler. On the other hand, the football team was itself changing. A few years earlier, Darrell Royal, the longtime, very successful coach, finally had the first varsity player black player on the team. Did he do that because he was, changing as a person, or did he do that because he wanted to win and continue to compete? These are questions I poke at. But he had become the coach in the late 50s, and he had an all-white team for the 1960s, and that had, in a lot of black households in Texas, he had gained a reputation um, for not being not welcoming black players. And when he goes to recruit Earl Campbell and Tyler, Earl's a little standoffish for this reason. And so there's a kind of poignant moment where Darrell Royal and Earl come together, and they become close friends. Actually, Darrell Royal, to a lot of his players, remained both feared and respected, but also distant. And oddly enough, Earl became one of the players who was closest to Darrell. So all of that's going on too. There's a lot of turbulence during this period, various kinds.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that, at some point during his college career, Earl even said, you hear a lot about race relations on this campus, and I don't really see it. Do you think, like, why do you think that is? Do you think it was because he was part of this team? Do you think it was because of his relationship with Darrell Royal? Like, it's very interesting because, he talks to Coach Royal and he says, I hear you don't really like black people. And then his position kind of changed. He realizes that maybe what he had heard isn't correct, or maybe he's the one that's helping change it. Like, how do you think that? I know it's hard to put words into somebody else's mouth, of course, but it's just interesting seeing that evolution kind of.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic question. I think part of it is that he's a star football player on the team. I think his experience was very different from contemporary black students who I also interviewed for the book.
Right.
Who felt more marginalized on campus. They'd have the campus police would check their IDs. Right. That kind of. They weren't Earl Campbell. So that's my daughter.
I love it.
Yeah, I could bring her on. So I think that's part of what's going on. I think it also has to do with the way he sees himself. When Earl wins the Heisman Award in 1977, he's asked about how he feels about being the first black player from a major Southern university to win the Heisman. Until that point, basically, if you had been a great black athlete, you either went out of state to Michigan or UCLA to play, or you played for a historically black school. And if you went to a historically black school, you didn't win the Heisman, basically. And he says, I don't think of myself as a black man, which is a pretty interesting thing to say. I mean, it's a completely reasonable thing to say. I mean, who am I to say whether it's reasonable or not? But it seems completely reasonable to say. But it's also from the perspective of 2019 or 2020, it sounds almost provocative. And of course, that's a whole other complicated thing about being a black athlete is that there are all these expectations and questions and projections that are asked of you and placed on you that aren't of white athletes. That's just based on my reporting. Obviously, I'm not living this myself. So I think part of it is that he was a star athlete. Part of it is Earl Campbell, who grew up on a farm and as I said, thought of himself as someone who brought people together rather than as somebody who was confrontational. Some of his close friends going back to high school were white athletes on the team. It also, interestingly, maybe she'll come. Alice, if you want to come in, you can come in for a minute. You're running up and down the hall. Interestingly, also, Darrell and he came together over music. Darrell Royal was a complicated figure in his own right. I mean, he had friends of all different stripes, and And one of his, you know, he had friends like Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson and, you know, country music musicians who were part of the counterculture. And so Daryl would have house parties with with Willie Nelson, and uh, and and invite Earl over. Often Earl was one of the few black athletes at these parties, but so they kind of got close together over music as well. So I think there are all these kind of interesting threads that are bringing them together.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about, which we touched on a little bit earlier, talking about him going out to the field and having all of these physical limitations that he now has as he's gotten older. You know, he had so many injuries, you know, that are very, very common in these athletes as they age, but his seem to be really, he still seems to really struggle with them. You know, every time I've seen him, whether it was at like a meet and greet or on the field, he's always been kind of either sitting down or being assisted in some way. And you mentioned that as being sort of, let me find the quote. You called it trading long-term health for money, fame, and greatness. And can you talk a little bit more about that? You know, outside of the racial obstacles he overcame, all the other obstacles he overcame, it's a big price to pay for, you know, obviously greatness and huge fame, especially here in Texas. And people are so appreciative of that. But can you talk a little bit more about that and the impact it had on him then and now?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, you can't tell a story about Earl Campbell without talking about that. I mean, he was a violent player, and that cut both ways. He meted out the violence, but it also, you know, had its effect on him. He endured a lot of injuries, and he said that he has some short-term memory problems now. He's in his mid-60s. He has had, you know, a bunch of back surgeries. He's had surgeries on his knees. It's hard to tell exactly what precisely is related to football and what might be a congenital problem. Although it's hard to imagine that these things don't have something to do with football. You know, you'd have linebackers who'd say, I lost a few IQ points every time I tried to tackle Earl Campbell. Which in a way is funny, but is also wince-worthy, reading those words now, given what we know about football and brain injuries. And, you know, there was a famous sports columnist out in LA who said that, you know, if you put a gun, basically. So these things sort of capture that brutality of the game and of trying to tackle Earl. Yeah, I mean, he's doing a little better than he was. He can move around, but he still relies on a walker. You know, when I interviewed him at his office, he sat behind a desk. And his walker was kind of placed to the side. And I got the impression that, you know, he didn't necessarily want to be seen walking around, partly because of pride. So I mean, I think one of the impressive things about him is that he still continues to overcome those kinds of things. I mean, in some ways, these are it's more of a challenge for him to walk 50 yards now with no tacklers than it was when everybody was out to get him. And I'm so glad you brought up that quote, because I think for a lot of us, you know, if we were told by our early 50s we wouldn't be able to walk if we chose this kind of profession, even in the face of fame and glory, we probably would walk away from the option. We might say, I'd rather live my humdrum life, earn my whatever pay I get in life, you know, have my family and be able to just enjoy myself until through old age, walking like a normal person. Um, but I think it says something about Earl that he's not exactly willing to do that looking back. I think he has a kind of ambivalence about blaming football for his injuries. And I think part of that is says something about the circumstances under which he grew up. He said to me that 90% of black men, of his age, never leave the Tyler city limits. That is to say, they didn't have economic opportunity. And yet here he was able to, pull his family out of poverty, not just his kids and his wife. They were junior high sweethearts. She grew up in a middle class home, but he grew up in basically a shack. But also his uh, his some of his cousins, his family more generally. And it's because of football that he was able to do that. So that that trade is more profound for him than it would be, I think, for us. It's not nearly as obvious. In fact, I think he's glad he made that trade. Um, and that's maybe something for us to think about when watching him, because I think there's a lot of, even as there's kind of great admiration for Earl Campbell, there's some amount of pity, partly because of the kind of the tragicness of being this kind of Superman figure who's now, has to rely on a walker. And I think part of it, of course, is wrapped up probably in our own guilt as football fans. I love watching football, but it feels a little lousy sometimes given what we know, of course. So, but that's something to think about. That I think that Earl wouldn't have been able to have the opportunity that he had if not for football.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great note to end it on. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah. I'm going to have a recording posted later. So
great. My parents love that.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. So yeah, we've been uploading these to our YouTube and stuff. So hopefully by this time tomorrow, I'll have it up. It takes a bit to kind of turn around, but yeah, for if you want to send it to your family to watch. But thank you again so much. I'll also include a link to buy your book and all that good stuff. So, but it was nice seeing you. It was good talking to you.